There are moments in sports that change everything. Not just the outcome of a match or a season, but the entire direction of a sport. What happened to Alex Eala in the spring of 2026 was one of those moments. A young Filipina tennis player, just 20 years old, found herself at the center of a storm that shook the entire women's tennis world. And the people who thought they were solving a problem ended up creating the biggest controversy in WTA history. If you want to stay updated on stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to Rally Radar right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our daily coverage of everything happening in women's tennis. We go beyond the scores and bring you the stories that actually matter. Now, let's get into what really happened with Alex Eala. To understand the ban, you first have to understand just how popular Alex Eala had become. This was not a slow and steady rise through the rankings. This was something different, something the tennis world had never quite seen before. Everywhere Eala played, thousands of Filipino fans showed up. They traveled across cities, across countries, and in many cases, across oceans, just to watch her compete. They wore her colors, waved their flags, and turned every single one of her matches into something that felt less like a tennis tournament and more like a national celebration. The energy was electric, and for a while, everyone seemed to love it. Ticket sales for her matches were through the roof. Merchandise with her name on it was flying off the shelves. Sponsors were lining up to be associated with her. From a pure popularity standpoint, Eala was a goldmine for the tour. But underneath all of that excitement, pressure was quietly building. The WTA and tournament organizers were struggling to keep up with the sheer scale of what Eala's presence was bringing, and they were running out of ways to manage it. Everything came to a head on March 27, 2026, at the Miami Open quarterfinals. Eala had just beaten Victoria Mboko in a three-set match that lasted nearly 3 hours. It was a brilliant performance, exactly the kind of tennis that had made her one of the most exciting players in the world to watch. The match itself was everything tennis fans could have hoped for, but the moment it ended, things fell apart. As soon as Eala raised her arms to celebrate, the crowd surged. Thousands of Filipino fans who had packed the 14,000-seat stadium rushed toward the court. Security personnel tried to hold the line, forming a human barrier between the fans and the playing surface, but they were completely overwhelmed. Fans spilled onto the baseline, they were waving flags, chanting, reaching out toward Eala. To her credit, she stayed calm and gracious throughout the chaos, signing autographs and taking photos, trying her best to manage a situation that had already gone far beyond anyone's control. Outside the stadium, it was even chaotic. Thousands of additional fans who had been unable to get tickets had gathered at outdoor viewing areas near the venue. When news of Eala's victory spread through the crowd, they too surged forward, overwhelming security checkpoints. 4 people were treated for minor injuries. 2 others were taken to hospitals suffering from heat exhaustion. The scenes made international news headlines, and none of the coverage was flattering. What some Filipino publications had playfully called Eala mania had reached a tipping point that nobody could ignore. Tournament officials held an emergency meeting that same night. The numbers they looked at were eye-opening. Ticket sales for Eala's matches were unlike anything they had seen. Every session featuring her sold out within hours of going on sale, but the infrastructure supporting those events simply could not handle the level of demand she was generating. Stadiums built for 14,000 people were being pushed to their absolute limits, and the crowds that gathered outside were adding another layer of pressure that nobody had properly planned for. Everything came to a head on March 27, 2026, at the Miami Open quarterfinals. Eala had just beaten Victoria Mboko in a 3-set match that lasted nearly 3 hours. It was a brilliant performance, exactly the kind of tennis that had made her one of the most exciting players in the world to watch. The match itself was everything tennis fans could have hoped for, but the moment it ended, things fell apart. As soon as Eala raised her arms to celebrate, the crowd surged. Thousands of Filipino fans who had packed the 14,000-seat stadium rushed toward the court. Security personnel tried to hold the line, forming a human barrier between the fans and the playing surface, but they were completely overwhelmed. Fans spilled onto the baseline, they were waving flags, chanting, reaching out toward Eala. To her credit, she stayed calm and gracious throughout the chaos, signing autographs and taking photos, trying her best to manage a situation that had already gone far beyond anyone's control. Outside the stadium, it was even chaotic. Thousands of additional fans who had been unable to get tickets had gathered at outdoor viewing areas near the venue. When news of Eala's victory spread through the crowd, they too surged forward, overwhelming security checkpoints. 4 people were treated for minor injuries. 2 others were taken to hospital suffering from heat exhaustion. The scenes made international news headlines, and none of the coverage was flattering. What some Filipino publications had playfully called Eala mania had reached a tipping point that nobody could ignore. Tournament officials held an emergency meeting that same night. The numbers they looked at were eye-opening. Ticket sales for Eala's matches were unlike anything they had seen. Every session featuring her sold out within hours of going on sale, but the infrastructure supporting those events simply could not handle the level of demand she was generating. Stadiums built for 14,000 people were being pushed to their absolute limits, and the crowds that gathered outside were adding another layer of pressure that nobody had properly planned for. In the days that followed, the full scale of the financial damage started to become clear. Broadcast partners were frustrated and making their feelings known. While Eala's matches were drawing huge viewership numbers, particularly in the Philippines and among Filipino communities around the world, they were also creating serious scheduling headaches. Her quarterfinal against Mboko had run nearly 40 minutes longer than expected, pushing the evening session into prime time and knocking out carefully arranged commercial breaks. Advertisers who had paid significant money for guaranteed visibility found their spots delayed or cut entirely. One financial officer, speaking without wanting to be named, put it plainly. From a revenue point of view, Eala was a blessing and a problem. She filled seats like no one else, but the costs that came with her were enormous, and when things went wrong, it was the organizers who had to answer for it. The financial picture was genuinely complicated. Eala's matches were generating nearly 50% more ticket revenue than comparable sessions featuring other players. Merchandise tied to her name made up close to a quarter of all tournament retail income. Sponsors were eager to pay premium rates just to have their branding visible during her matches. But on the other side of the ledger, the costs were staggering. Security budgets for her matches had to be tripled, additional medical staff had to be stationed at every session she played, insurance premiums for the tournament were already projected to climb by 22% for the following year, with underwriters specifically pointing to crowd incidents involving Eala as the driving factor. Then, the broadcast partners made their move. Several international networks, worn down by the unpredictability of Eala's matches, came back to the table demanding renegotiated contracts. They wanted guarantees. Guaranteed start times, guaranteed match durations, guaranteed commercial breaks. These were things that tournament officials simply could not promise. And when it became clear that those assurances would not be coming, the networks threatened to scale back their coverage of future WTA events entirely. The WTA found itself caught between a rock and a hard place, and something was about to give. On April 2, 2026, the WTA released a statement that sent shockwaves through the entire tennis world. The organization announced that it had made the difficult decision to indefinitely suspend Alex Eala from all WTA-sanctioned events. The statement said the decision had been made following a comprehensive review of recent tournament operations and player conduct. It cited repeated crowd management problems, unsustainable operational costs, and what it described as an unmanageable competitive environment. The WTA acknowledged Eala's talent and her popularity, but said the current situation simply could not be allowed to continue. The decision, it said, had been unanimous. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the hashtag demanding that Eala be allowed to play was trending in 27 countries. Filipino fans flooded every social media platform with messages of outrage, grief, and disbelief. Players, both currently active and retired, started speaking out. Novak Djokovic, who had previously come to Eala's defense during a scheduling controversy at the Australian Open, was one of the first to react publicly. He said that banning a player for being popular was not how you handle success. You adapt, you evolve, and you find solutions. Walking away from the problem by punishing the player responsible for your growth is admitting failure. Coco Gauff, who was both a friend of Eala's and her occasional doubles partner, was clearly upset. She described herself as heartbroken on Eala's behalf and insisted that the WTA should have been celebrating her, not punishing her. Behind closed doors, inside the locker room, the picture was more complicated. Not every player was publicly condemning the decision. Some veterans, speaking without wanting to be identified, admitted that they had grown tired of what they described as playing away matches every time they faced Eala. They talked about the scheduling disruptions, the noise levels, and the sense that the spotlight had become permanently fixed on one player. They were careful to say it was not Eala's fault, but they also felt it was not a fair situation for anyone else on the tour. Not everyone felt that way, though. Jessica Pegula, who had beaten Eala in Miami the previous year and faced her again in 2026, spoke up strongly in her defense. She said that playing against Eala in front of her fans had been an incredible experience, and that punishing a player for making the sport better was simply wrong. Iga Swiatek, who had been beaten by Eala in a memorable quarterfinal the previous year, offered a more measured take. She acknowledged that losing to Eala in front of that kind of crowd was not an easy experience, but she also said that was sports, and if you could not handle those conditions, maybe you were in the wrong profession. The WTA Players Council held an emergency meeting of its own. Reports suggested the discussion was heated, with some members arguing that the ban set a dangerous precedent that could one day be used against any player deemed too disruptive, and others insisting the organization had to think about what was best for the whole tour. Eala, told about the meeting, chose not to attend. People close to her said she was devastated, but determined to avoid public battles. She had always let her tennis speak for her, and she was not going to change that now. If the WTA had hoped the ban would calm things down, they had deeply underestimated what they were dealing with. Within days, protests broke out outside the WTA's headquarters in St. Petersburg, Florida. Thousands of Filipino fans, many of whom had traveled from across the country, gathered outside the building carrying signs reading "Free Eala" and declaring that tennis without Eala was nothing. The demonstrations were peaceful, but they were impossible to dismiss. Online, the response was even more dramatic. A petition calling on the WTA to reverse its decision gathered 2.3 million signatures in just its first week, making it the fastest-growing petition in the history of the sport. Filipino communities around the world began organizing boycotts of WTA events, promising to pull back the ticket purchases and viewership numbers that had been making the tour genuinely profitable. Sponsors started to pay close attention. Nike, Eala's main clothing sponsor, put out a carefully worded statement saying it had concerns about the decision. Babolat, her racket sponsor, went a step further and threatened to reevaluate its entire relationship with WTA events if the ban was not reconsidered. Philippine-based sponsors, including BPI, Globe, and Milo, went even further, announcing they were pausing all WTA-related marketing activities until the situation was resolved. The financial consequences were immediate and serious. The WTA had done the math on what it would cost them to lose Eala's presence. What they had not calculated was the cost of making her fans angry. Sponsorship deals that had already been committed for the following year suddenly became uncertain. Broadcast partners, already on edge after the Miami chaos, started asking pointed questions about the tour's stability and its future direction. The WTA had thought it was taking control of a difficult situation. Instead, it had walked into a much bigger one. On April 15, 2026, Eala's legal team filed a formal appeal with the Court of Arbitration for Sport. The document ran to 47 pages and laid out a detailed and damaging case against the WTA. It argued that the ban violated basic principles of due process, that Eala had never been formally told about any specific rule infractions, and that the decision had been arbitrary and driven by factors that had nothing to do with the reasons officially given for it. Most damning of all, the appeal included testimony from crowd safety experts who said what happened in Miami had been entirely predictable and entirely preventable. Tournament organizers, the document argued, had received clear warnings following crowd incidents at the Australian Open in January and had failed to put in place any adequate crowd management measures before Miami. The WTA had months to address the problem. Instead of doing so, they chose to blame a 20-year-old for their own failure to prepare. The appeal also pointed to what it called the selective nature of the punishment. Throughout tennis history, certain players had drawn massive, passionate crowds that created logistical challenges for tournaments. Serena Williams at the US Open, Roger Federer at Wimbledon, Novak Djokovic in Serbia. None of them had ever been suspended for their popularity. Eala, the appeal concluded, was being punished for one reason only. She had succeeded in a way the WTA had not expected and could not control. That was not a violation of any rule. That was a failure of leadership. The Court of Arbitration for Sport agreed to fast-track the case and scheduled a hearing for May 15th. For the next month, Eala's entire career was in the balance. She could not compete. She could not earn ranking points. She could only wait and trust that the process would produce the right outcome. It was an extraordinarily difficult period for a 20-year-old who had done nothing except become extraordinarily good at tennis and inspire millions of people in the process. When the Court of Arbitration for Sport finally ruled, it overturned the ban. The WTA's decision was found to be without proper basis. Eala was free to return to competition. She made her comeback at Roland Garros in June 2026. When she walked out onto court Philippe Chatrier for her first match, the atmosphere was unlike anything that had been seen at the French Open in years. Thousands of Filipino flags filled the stands. Chants of support rose up and echoed around the stadium. Her opponent was a French wildcard, a local player who would ordinarily have had the crowd firmly behind her. Instead, the court had been transformed into something else entirely. Every point Eala won was met with roars. Every rally felt like a statement. She won comfortably in straight sets, 6-3, 6-2. After match point, she dropped her racket. She covered her face with both hands and cried. In the stands, her family cried with her. Her coaches, her friends, her fans, all sharing a moment that had grown into something much larger than tennis. At the press conference afterward, she was asked what the moment meant to her. Her voice broke as she answered. She said it meant everything, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt like they did not belong, every person who had felt like their voice did not matter, every person who had ever felt like the system was working against them. The WTA tried to remove the most popular player in women's tennis from the sport. They tried to solve a problem of their own making by punishing a young woman who had done nothing wrong. The plan backfired completely. The court overturned the ban. The sponsors threatened to walk. The fans took to the streets. And through all of it, Eala carried herself with a level of grace and dignity that only made more people fall in love with her story. She came back, she played, and she won. The WTA's credibility took a hit it may not fully recover from. But the sport itself, the competition, the drama, the magic of watching someone extraordinary do something extraordinary came out the other side stronger than ever. Whether this was the single biggest mistake in WTA history is something people will be debating for a long time. But one thing is clear: you cannot stop a movement by banning the person at the center of it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you think. And if you are not already subscribed to Rally Radar, now is the time. We bring you daily WTA news, match breakdowns, and the stories that go beyond the scoreline. Because at Rally Radar, every day is match day.